Hi, everyone. I'm attorney Donna DiMaggio Berger, and this is Take It to the Board, where we speak condo and HOA. Our guest today served for 28 years with the Town of Palm Beach Police Department, the last 8 years serving as the island's chief of police. Michael Reiter is also the founder and president of Michael Reiter and Associates, a company specializing in the protection of high net worth individuals and their organizations. Michael's team of security advisors includes former state and local law enforcement officers, special agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Secret Service, Department of State, Department of Homeland Security, military special forces personnel, and other security experts. Michael has appeared on national TV shows such as Dateline, discussing his role in overseeing the original investigation of Jeffrey Epstein in the early 2000s. Michael has served on his Palm Beach community's board of directors for approximately 8 years and has served as president of the HOA for 5 of those years. I worked with Michael in that board several years ago and found him to be direct and highly principled. He brings a unique perspective to serving on an association board for our listeners. But before we get started, I want to remind our listeners that Michael's thoughts and comments today are his own and are not being given on behalf of his community, nor is he providing specific advice to your community. As always, speak to your own professional advisors if today's episode sparks some follow-up questions for you. With that being said, Michael, welcome to Take It to the Board.
Thank you very much, Donna. Happy to help.
So, Michael, during your time as police chief, were crimes involving community association board members or community association managers ever investigated by your office?
Yes, of course. We investigated and prosecuted several instances of embezzlement, usually by association managers, occasionally by board members.
I mentioned in the intro, Michael, how long you had served in that capacity. How many of those types of cases would you say you saw over your tenure?
I would say probably a couple dozen.
Wow. And what forms of crimes were committed in community associations?
Most of them involve credit card theft, petty cash transactions to pay for personal expenses. They typically begin small, and then when they're undetected over a period of time, it emboldens the thief to make larger transactions. I know of cases where I believe we've had losses in excess of $200,000 by an association manager during the time I was on the police department.
Well, you know, serving on your board of directors that you have to be in Florida, you have to be certified to serve on a community association board of directors. And you can do that either by signing a statement that you've read and understand and agree to uphold the governing documents, or you can attend a class. You know, at my firm, Becker, we teach hundreds of those board certification classes each year. And part of that, I do a fraud detection class. You know, I know you could probably teach that class better than I can. And you mentioned something that's of interest. Typically, at least in my research, Michael, when a fraudster has been detected, the fraud's been going on for about 2 years already. Is that true?
I would say yes, more often than not. But typically, it's detected when there is an audit done at the end of a fiscal year. So in many occasions, it takes at least a year to find the fraud. You
mentioned petty theft, although a couple $100,000 is not really petty, but you've got real crimes here where you've had managers and perhaps even board members that are embezzling funds, or they're using the credit card, as you said. In the past, they even used debit cards, although the Florida legislature outlawed the use of debit cards for that very reason. Would you see typically in the cases you mentioned, Michael, would it be a manager that would be taking these liberties? Would it be the treasurer or just any board member? How did these cases roll out for you?
At least in my experience as a law enforcement officer, most of them were managers. And it was as a result of someone looked at a source document like an online access to bank account and realized that the balance doesn't match the one that is placed into the monthly financial report. Or when there's an annual audit and the auditors find something off track. Some of them go on for many years. I've seen instances of phony employees where a check was going to a family member of the manager. And in one particular case I know of, that took years to determine that it was a fraud situation.
That's interesting. So, and I've used this example myself. You've got to really look at the invoices, because if you had, and I'm going to use just an ABC, if there is this company, I'm not referencing a specific company, but if it's ABC Roofing Inc., and the payments being made out to ABC Roofing LLC, Is that one way that the fraud could be, go undetected for quite some time because the names are so similar?
Certainly, I am aware of instances in other jurisdictions where they actually they somehow set up an account in a bank under the name of an actual organization in a different part of the state. How they accomplished that, I'm not sure, forged documents or something. And that real business did no work, and the fake business did no work for the association. And there were payments made over a long period of time with just a phony conduit of a way to get funds from the association.
What about collusion, Michael? It was always my understanding that fraud can really take hold when you have more than one person perpetrating it. If you could just speak to collusion in terms of maybe a manager or bookkeeper recommends hiring a friend for another position, how does that work?
Anytime that you can have one of the checks and balances involved in the employee that is perpetrating the fraud, then you've removed one of the accounting procedures that would detect the problem. I have seen previously where a board member and a manager wanted to compensate the manager in addition to the amount that was approved by the board. So they created a phony situation of invoices. In that case, you've really taken everybody out of the equation other than the board members and the auditing firm that has a chance to find it. And those are much more difficult to find.
Yeah, I was going to say, who should be looking over other people's shoulders to make sure that there's nothing nefarious going on?
Everyone. I think to be a board member and have that fiduciary responsibility, and a manager as well, you should create an environment where it's accepted to question suspicious payments, unusual things, and not take offense by it. And everyone should question it. The kinds of things that I tell people that I've learned from my law enforcement career that would help either discourage or detect one of these things are not paying any checks or payments of any type to a board member. Completely avoid that. If it's necessary, then have multi-level approval. Credit card receipts have to be matched to invoices and reconciled monthly. The association accountants should do some spot check of credit cards to confirm legitimacy when they do their review. Limiting automatic payments is important, both out of just failure to oversee things and by fraud. I've seen instances where payments have gone on for a long period of time when no goods or services were any longer being provided to the association. It really comes down to 2 board members should authorize every payment. If it's a large organization, it's high volume and there's not enough time to do that, then there should be a threshold set that over a certain amount, 2 board members are authorizing it. The delinquency report is also very important to watch, because I've heard of instances where certain persons did not pay their monthly assessment, their quarterly assessment, whichever it is. And when they were caught, they would say, well, I did it in exchange for this other thing. They let me out of it. And that was a collusion situation between the manager and an individual owner. I think having access to all of the source documents now that all bank accounts are online is essential for every board member.
I was just going to say that, because if you have a middleman who is saying, here's the bank statements this month, and producing it, some of the instances of fraud that I've heard about involved a manager or the treasurer, perhaps, as they say, cooking the books, creating an entirely different bank statement each month and presenting it to the board for their review.
Yes. And another technique that can be done is duplicate bank statements. You can have a bank statement sent to the association manager and to the treasurer. That way they can match them up. When I was treasurer of my association, I did that. I would compare to the statement in the monthly report to make sure that it was the same, as a fraud prevention mechanism.
Well, you've mentioned source documents, Michael. Can you just tell us quickly, what are you referring to?
Well, I mean, if your maintenance man goes to Home Depot and buys equipment or buys supplies, and then that appears on a Home Depot credit card or on another credit card, I think you have to look at that actual receipt from Home Depot. And to some extent, somebody should say, well, why did we buy $97 worth of XYZ lubricant? What are we lubricating? I think that keeps honest people honest. If you don't question those things and you have an employee who gets in a financial situation and they know they can get away with it, it becomes risky. It provides opportunity for them to commit a crime, and questioning these things. And I do that as president of my association. I'll look exactly through the Home Depot statement, and I'm familiar with a lot of things that are sold there. And I would say at least every other month, there are a few things on there that make no sense to me. And usually there's a very good explanation, but I question it. And a lot of boards don't have an environment like that. I think those that should question it are afraid to. They're afraid to ruffle anyone's feathers. Hopefully that their legal counsel or accountants or someone somewhere tells them that is exactly the environment you have to have to not only prevent serious fraud, but to keep honest people honest.
I think you're right. Sometimes it's fear. And listen, I don't want to offend my fellow board member or the employee or what have you. And sometimes it's lack of time. These are volunteer roles. So a lot of times you've got people serving on the board that maybe shouldn't be serving on the board. They don't have the time to really put in to do that job well. And it's just easier, isn't it, to hope that everything is being handled correctly?
Well, it is. And one of the warning signs is if the board member is given their password to the accounting program that the association used to give their password to the property manager and says, well, just act like you're me and approve all the ones that need to be approved, you have a serious problem. I think that some people accept these roles without realizing the responsibility that goes with them. And it is time consuming. But if you want to have a wonderful place to live, some people have to be willing to take the time and do this.
What are some other red flags that people should look out for? I mean, we've got a lot of people that are listening that now are starting to think, maybe we don't have every check and balance. Maybe we haven't really looked at the statements. I get them. They're mailed to me as a board member, but I just assume everything is going well. I know one of the things I taught in my class, Michael, is if you do have an employee or a board member or officer who never leaves the job, they can never take off for vacation. They're never sick. They're always there. They can either be the most diligent worker on the planet, or it could be a red flag. Could it not, that they don't want anybody else stepping into their shoes and perhaps seeing what's going on?
That could be. I will tell you some of the things I've heard when conducting criminal investigations after a theft has been identified. The kinds of things that board members say are, she was the best employee we've ever had. Very typical. The fact that someone can do their job very well on a day-to-day basis doesn't mean they're any more or less honest than anyone else. The other thing I would look for is a long-term employee that has begun to be overly friendly and have relationships with owners. One case that I can think of, and this was some time ago, and it was in the town of Palm Beach, that a manager was given proxies by a number of the members. And I don't even know if that's technically legal today. And they came to the board meeting and they had a lot of weight because they could vote for 4 or 5 or 6 board members. And as a result, people treated them differently, this person differently. And, that's just a risky situation. I think that you have to remember who an employee serves. I try to remind our employees occasionally, they don't serve individual owners or residents. They serve the association. And they should never be acting in a way that disadvantages the association for the benefit of an individual owner.
For the benefit of our listeners, a couple things. In Florida, proxies cannot be used in a condominium or a cooperative election for election of directors. They can still be used for homeowners associations elections unless the documents for that particular HOA require a condo type election, which would require anonymous ballots. But really what we've been discussing, Michael, is the fraud triangle, which is a person who is in a position of trust, whether it's the manager, a valued bookkeeper, a board member, even it could be a resident who's volunteering on a committee. So you've got a person of trust, then you've got opportunity, and you've got the rationalization. And you've touched on all of those. The rationalization could be, look, I've worked for this community or I've served on the board for 10, 12 years, and I'm entitled to this. I mean, when you investigated, did you find that kind of pervasive feeling amongst the fraudsters that, hey, I'm kind of entitled?
Well, when you're a detective and you interview somebody in a case like this, they know more about what happened than you do. And your job as a detective is to make them believe that you know everything. In many cases, particularly when there are large losses and the higher value properties just have higher value losses because it's more expensive to operate them. The maintenance fees are much higher and so on. And so typically they do not, the suspects in these cases do not talk to the detective. So there's usually not a lot of discussion about it. But in general with frauds, and I've arrested banking employees for theft up to the point where they basically give up and confess if that happens. There's usually all sorts of transference of responsibility. Nobody ever told me I couldn't do that. I only borrowed the money and then I put some of it back. There's lots of excuses made until they get to the point where they realize, if they are going to confess, that they need to do that not only for consideration in their case, but to move on in their lives. And I had a case not long ago in my business where we investigated a financial crime, and this was a over $1 million loss. And this was an employee of a household. And until the very end, all the way through it, this employee maintained that he was not responsible and did not commit the crime, even though that there was a great deal of evidence to show otherwise.
And that employee eventually confessed, or you had to prove the case?
No, that employee did not confess, never confessed, and maintained that they didn't do it through the very end, although it was completely clear that he did. There was a great volume of evidence to support it. And so it was that person chose the deny approach all the way to the very end and stayed with it the whole way through. And
was he prosecuted?
No, it was an instance where it would have caused embarrassment to the victim, and the victim chose otherwise. Unfortunately, we have the most liberal public records law in the country. And until recently, when victims were able to have their name removed from the reports, that tends to change when you get to court. If there's a trial, all of the details, which in a small community can be figured out who the person is, even if the name is redacted. That affects it.
Wow. I'm sitting here thinking about the fact that Florida law, changed in the aftermath of the Surfside tragedy. And there are now requirements for reserve funding starting in 2025, maybe sooner, for associations that want to get the jump on it. We're going to see millions and millions of dollars in reserve funds in communities throughout Florida. That's going to mean more money. That's going to mean more potential exposure for these communities to fraud. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I think that for many communities that are not going to be able to appropriately fund the kinds of repairs that are necessary, that it presents opportunities for developers to come in and do a takeover and build a higher, better, more expensive use community in their place. That's already begun. You've seen it. I heard it talked about on prior podcasts that you did. But the reserve fund should be treated completely differently than the other funds. That should be something that every imaginable check and balance is in place before you actually go to those funds, because you can't borrow from the reserve fund. You can't use the reserve fund for day-to-day operations or to give your team a raise or any of those sorts of things, but it will be a big number. For associations that operate from month to month, it's going to be more money that they've ever had as a balance at any one time. Therefore, it makes it more attractive to a criminal who would try to get their hands on it.
Yeah, I'm worried about it. And I do think that associations who have never employed checks and balances before, or they rely on the manager to do that, they really need to take a hard look about how they are going to manage and operate those reserve funds, talk to their association attorney, talk to their accountant, talk to their insurance agent. And of course, there should be fidelity bonding for anybody who's controlling and dispersing funds in the association.
Typically, you have a problem before you create a solution. You're suggesting a solution before the problem gets too big. And hopefully associations will take notice of that, and potentially that the legislature may as well.
Florida's shared ownership statutes criminalize boards receiving anything of value from vendors, with certain exceptions for educational materials. However, the rumor mill says that many vendors believe that they have to make a deal with the manager or the board if they are going to be able to get the business. I'm always amazed that some of these vendors don't report that. If that's really out there happening and they're not reporting it, it is a crime in Florida. Do you think the behavior that, vendors are having to give kickbacks is as pervasive as the rumor mill suggests?
It's corruption. It is certainly going on. every association manager should realize there's civil and criminal penalties for doing it. Do I think that most vendors realize that it's a crime to do that? No, I don't think most vendors do know. Although there have been plenty of prosecutions and criminal penalties, prison sentences, and so on for people that have created schemes. They're basically fraud schemes and theft schemes like this. I think that it's something you should put in your vendor contracts of prohibiting it, to notify them that it's illegal for a property manager or board member to accept anything of value. That will help get the word out. I think we all have to be reminded that these are financial crimes. I have certainly heard about it a great deal. I've talked to vendors. The vendors don't want to report it because they're not going to get business. The construction industry is full of this as well. Your listeners don't really know what we're talking about. Is okay, you've hired a plumber to do a $10,000 plumbing job, and the plumber says, well, charge $13,000 and I'll give you $2,000 back to the manager. That kind of activity, yes, I think goes on quite often. As I mentioned, it is a type of not only criminal behavior, but it is corruption. And I would say that the way to combat it is, if you are offered a situation like that, is to not do business with that vendor and to tell the vendor why.
And it also means that you might be your association may be hiring the wrong vendors. You may not be making your decision to hire based on the ones with the most expertise, the best fit for your community, but the one that has appealed to the manager or the board member that is looking for a kickback.
And the victim in that is the association and the individual owners, because they're paying more for the product, even if it is a competent service, than they would have to if they hired someone who didn't want a kickback. I would say that one of the things that needs to be done is a real reminder to anyone who is offering businesses to associations, community associations, that they can't do this. There's no excuse for an association manager to say that they didn't know that this was improper.
So this begs the question, though, Michael. There has to be a reason that so many people feel emboldened to engage in this kind of process. And it has to be that we're just not seeing the arrests and the incarceration of people who engage in this kind of activity. Is law enforcement going to step it up when it comes to this, or what do you think?
In anticipation of this question, I did a little bit of research. There are numerous cases in the news media of managers that went to prison for doing these kinds of things. Usually, it grows into something that's worse than that. It usually grows into billing for work not performed at all. Instead of saying, just price it higher. I've installed 5 trees, but I'm going to give you a bill for 15, and I'll give you this kickback, which is even a worse situation. Is it something that law enforcement is going to think is an easy case for them, or will law enforcement even know that it is illegal? Not always. It's not a common crime to them. The kind of cases that they normally investigate are not like this. They're simple thefts, frauds, burglaries, robberies, etc. This feels like a civil case to the average law enforcement officers. It's worthy to do some education there, so they realize when these are reported. But most of the time, they're not reported. Why? If you're a board member or if you're an association manager somewhere and you've been solicited, that's one thing. But if you're caught in the act, it's an embarrassment. People don't want to report it. It could be in the news media, and it's like any other crime. They're reluctant for lots of different reasons to report something like this. I asked a couple of association managers recently how often they hear of it. And I think most of those association managers who are so disgusted by it, they carry themselves in such a way that no one would offer that kind of an incentive to them. But maybe that's part of the answer, is at the very first mention of anything like that, and I'll take care of you later on. Or if you ever have a plumbing problem at your house, you call me. It won't cost anything. At the very first sound of that, stop the person and tell them that's improper. And if it's serious enough, not use them because of it, and let them know that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Michael, because I think about the managers I've worked with for, more than 2 decades. Listen, they're not going to risk their careers, their livelihood, and the reputations they've worked so hard to build over those decades to engage in that kind of corruption. But for those that are out there, again, I think it's still happening, and I think it's going to take probably some headlines to wake people up and know that you can compete for this kind of work by doing good work.
That's right. And in the construction industry, particularly in the Northeast, it is an accepted methodology of getting a subcontractor engagement. And, no one there wants to be the one who goes to law enforcement and says, I was solicited a payoff in order to get this contract. And that's illegal in most states for fear of losing the work. And until somebody has courage enough to report these kinds of situations when they begin, there'll never be an investigation, and then there won't be prosecutions. Although there have been a few in Florida.
And I know this is a topic for several of our Florida legislatures, so I'm sure they'll be looking and working in the future. They've strengthened the statute, and we'll see what happens. So let's move from one dark topic to another dark topic, Michael. We've been talking about fraud, and now I want to talk about the potential for violence in our communities. Unfortunately, it happens more than ever now. I think maybe it's just the general incivility we're all witnessing. I've been to board meetings and membership meetings. Things get heated. For the last 2.5 years, Michael, I've been doing most of my meetings by Zoom. So even if somebody gets really heated, we can mute them or even, remove them. We don't have that same threat that we've had in the past of potential violence going on inside the community. I'm sure you read about the tragedy a couple of weeks ago. The Atlanta manager, Michael Shinners, he was shot and killed. The condominium's building engineer was also shot and injured. Given the rising level of this, can anything be done to prevent the kind of tragedy that occurred to Michael Shinner? I mean, are we going to see metal detectors erected? This is not the first time a manager has been shot and killed in the community association, by the way.
There are definitely things that associations can do to reduce the likelihood that something like this would happen. When you mentioned the Atlanta case, I guess we live in a world now where an association should make clear that weapons are not allowed in their meetings. And more importantly, when threats of physical harm are expected, or when a person has exhibited threatening or violent behavior in the past, it should be made clear that future similar behavior will not be tolerated. I think that if that kind of behavior occurs, or you expect it, that associations should consider engaging a law enforcement or security officer to be present to keep the peace. Most law enforcement agencies in Florida have a program that allow for that. In some cases, they're off-duty officers. In others, they're active on-duty police officers paid an hourly rate directly to the law enforcement agency. The security officers, in my opinion, are probably less effective in that situation, but they're also less costly. And you would have probably some owners who would say that they're offended by the necessity for that. But in the world today, you never really know where your risks are coming from.
You know what, Michael? I have advised communities to hire off-duty police officer to attend meetings. As I said, pre-pandemic, when I went to more of these meetings in person, it has worked very well. I agree with you about the security guard. If you have regular security guards in your community, just asking Ned to come sit at the meeting is probably not going to be as large a deterrent to potential bad behavior as having an off-duty armed police officer there. And it has worked. And I will tell you, in my experience, in the most dysfunctional of communities, they've only had to do that once or twice, and then the troublemaker has settled down because they know the routine. They will be removed from that meeting by that officer.
And the other thing, if it ever actually does turn to physical violence, I think calling 911 immediately and following through with a complaint is important, because it makes a statement about what behavior you're willing to accept at a meeting. I have been at association meetings where people threaten physical violence. And I think that, in my view, as a president of the association, if somebody did that, I would tell the person to leave. You, as the lawyer, may say that you can't do that to an owner, But if they've committed a crime in front of everybody, I think that you have to do that.
Not only do I agree with you, I will give you an example. Years ago, I went to a meeting. It was the first meeting post-transition. The developer still owned a home in the community. He came to the meeting. We were talking about, the next steps in the evolution of the community. He didn't like what he heard. And he said to me, I'm going home to get my gun and then I'm going to come back and kill you. And he laughed and I said, meeting adjourned, because I wasn't going to take that risk and I wasn't going to have people there. So we adjourned the meeting. Okay. And then at the next meeting we called, there was an armed police officer there and it solved the problem. But I don't take any chances with that either.
The other thing is when something horrific like that happens, and I'm sorry that happened to you, it never should happen, then it's worthy, even after the meeting, of making a report to the law enforcement agency of what happened. That way you get it on the record. And if something worse does happen later on, there's a place for law enforcement to start. Or if the situation suggests that you should get a protective order, or in this case, he threatened to get his gun, we have a law in Florida that would allow a red flag law that would allow law enforcement to go and take his guns as a result of him threatening you with a gun. Get it recorded. It's just a matter of record. Tell the law enforcement agency, I want a report written. I'd like a case number. This is what happened, in case something has to happen down the road. If you have to go to a judge and get a restraining order, then you've set up the beginning of the documentation necessary to do that.
I'm so glad you brought up the police report, because a lot of times people don't follow through on that. And to be honest with you, I didn't that night. This was years ago. And I did not, contact the police and make a police report. But I'm glad you brought that up, because it is helpful. And a lot of times people don't want to, they don't want to take that extra step, whether it's out of embarrassment and they don't feel comfortable. Listen, you were in law enforcement. I'm an attorney. Sometimes people are not comfortable talking to people in either of our professions.
Well, that's true. When a law enforcement officer is called to a scene, they're thinking about, how do I resolve this? How do I move on to the next call? Many agencies have call stack. Police officers go from call to call. So what you have to say if you want a report made is, I'd like to have a full report made. I'd like to have the case number now. The officer calls in, gets the case number, writes it down on their card, and gives it to you. Otherwise, it's something known as a CAD, computer-aided dispatching entry, and it's not something the court's going to accept later on if you have to get a restraining order. You want a short report written that describes what occurred and has details about the name and address and phone number of persons that were present.
I always tell clients, if things get heated and there's any fear that things may get physical or violent, contact the police. A lot of times these kind of squabbles, Michael, they happen out in the parking lot. So people are squabbling over parking spaces. Could happen in an elevator. It's not always it. Typically, they're not at meetings. They're just at the pool when people are using the amenities. When should people call the police, and when shouldn't they call the police?
Unfortunately, in the environment that we are in, that almost every day there is an active attacker somewhere in the nation. I think when you have a gut feeling that someone's about to get hurt or could be hurt, or someone is threatened to use a weapon, as in your case, to go home and get their firearm, then you have to err on the side of caution and call law enforcement. What we hear so many times after a horrible incident has gone on is the people that knew, those involved, said, we knew that was happening. It's been going on for a long time. We should have expected this was going to happen, but they did nothing about it.
Yeah, if you have neighbors in your community and you refer to them as the Hatfields and the McCoys, you might have a heads up that this could turn violent. So I would say reach out to counsel. I've had clients reach out to me in those situations, and we've employed certain legal strategies and even just practical strategies to try to manage the situation.
But you do have to remember, some of these instances are not board responsibilities. When there's a neighbor-to-neighbor problem and it elevates to a violation of the law or something horrible about to happen, individuals should call the law enforcement agency to respond. And you can do that anonymously now as well. But I try not to involve the association in issues between individual owners if they're not association issues.
It's a really good point, but I would say to our listeners, reach out to your attorney, get a legal opinion. There was a case, Michael, coming out of DC. An owner was harassing a renter and she complained about it to the manager, who did not let the board know that this complaint had been made. That individual owner stabbed the tenant. She survived, but she wound up suing the association and the management company. So there are nuances here. I agree with you. Sometimes it is a neighbor versus neighbor situation, and it really doesn't involve the association. But the association becomes involved when they know about the issue and they know that there's harassment taking place and there's a potential for violence. So I would suggest reaching out and getting an opinion from counsel on what the extent of the association's involvement should be.
Always. I mean, that's a very important part of it. Your firm, Becker, has done very well for the association where I live. When in doubt, I call you, I call the lawyer, I call others in your firm, because I realize I look at it from sometimes I can't see the forest for the trees situation. You're looking at it from an unemotional, separated viewpoint, and it's good to have different opinions. When I said we try not to get the association involved in neighbor to neighbor issues, they aren't usually as severe as what you've said. And I do think when a resident or an owner asks for the association to be involved, you definitely have to evaluate whether or not it's an association responsibility. But many times things are brought to the attention of the association by third parties, and no one's asking for the association to be involved. And that case notwithstanding, I just try not to get the association involved unless it's necessary or I get advice otherwise.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I previously spoke to, we had a guest on, his name was Phil Huber of Platinum Group Security. He advised association boards to work with local law enforcement to protect their communities. I believe Phil was a former Miami Beach police chief. My question for you, Michael, is how did the Palm Beach Police Department, when you were there, work with local communities to achieve their security goals?
Police departments should create a dialogue and establish mutual trust with their communities. It was really the central theme of what I tried to accomplish when I was chief of police. Palm Beach Police Department has an organization called Palm Beach Crime Watch, and we would have 500 people in a waiting list at our annual meeting. We had national level speakers at that, and many different programs, citizens and teen police academies, large volunteer program. I think there's nothing better when someone has a problem and they come into their police department, instead of talking to a government employee, they first are greeted by their neighbor. That worked very well for us. So once there's trust, in our case, when we were able to build it to its peak, our calls for service, our calls of suspicious persons and incidents went up dramatically because people felt that the reporting of suspicious activity was welcomed by the police department, and they knew it would be acted on appropriately, and that if they asked for a call back to say what happened, we would give it to them. Most agencies don't do that. Once you have that kind of environment, and you can't have it in every community, then you can start doing the kinds of things that really do reduce crime. And I was fortunate to be allowed to be innovative and to have the resources to address crime. Most police departments today, if your association if you contact your law enforcement agency and ask for a crime prevention survey, where you would have a certified crime prevention practitioner, police officer, come out to your association and talk about your security lighting and different elements, your landscaping and other things that encourage or discourage crime. That's a program everybody should take advantage of.
Is there a charge for that, Michael, that program, to come out and do a security assessment by local law enforcement?
There's not in the Palm Beach Police Department, and I think it's kind of rare, at least in Florida. There was a very big program for years to train crime prevention practitioners to do this. Normally, there would not be a charge for that. The officers that do this, they study CPTED, which is crime prevention through environmental design, and they can point out the kinds of things that a burglar is going to notice to cause an association to be seen as low-hanging fruit. One of my favorite sayings about security is, if you and I encounter a bear in the woods, I don't have to outrun the bear, just you. So if you are that neighborhood that has poor lighting and no security and no cameras there and valuable things lying out and doors unlocked, you're going to be the place that the criminals target because they have the most likelihood of being successful there and getting away without being detected.
So a good point is reach out to local law enforcement before you need to reach out to local law enforcement. Get to know them, let them get to know you and your community. And that's a really good segue into a question I wanted to ask you about that I'm often asked about by my boards is what can be done when there's a suspected sexual predator that the board or residents believe is living in the community. I don't like my boards to become vigilantes, to take it upon themselves to try to figure that out. I think that can be a very slippery slope and be very dangerous. So one of my recommendations is usually contact local law enforcement to come out and speak to the community about the issue, about the sexual predator program, what can be done. What do you think, Michael?
The state of Florida and the federal government both have websites. The state of Florida's website, you can Google Florida sex offender search. You can simply put in your address and you can say, I'd like a list of all the registered sexual offenders or predators within a quarter mile of this address, or 1 mile, or a half mile. If it's a particular address in a building, you put the address in, it's going to tell you. Sexual predators and offenders, and a predator is a more serious level criminal than an offender, are required by statute to report where they live. And they have some limitations where they can live. They can't live within a certain distance from a school, et cetera, playground. What I tried to do when I was in law enforcement, and it was a rare occasion that a sexual predator or offender moved into my jurisdiction, but when they did, we would proactively notify the neighbors of that situation. Do we want them to do anything about it? Absolutely not. But on the other hand, they should be forewarned as being forearmed. What I do kind of automatically is when I'm on a computer and think about it, I put in my zip code just to see if there are any new sexual offenders that has moved into my zip code. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. Obviously, if your association is conducting a background check on the either at a time of a purchase or a lease, then that would be part of the background check and should be part of the background check to confirm whether or not they are a sexual offender.
Where this has come to play in some of my communities has not been the offender or the predator was not the applicant, but was later moved in as a significant other of the owner or the tenant. And that's where it got a little bit dicey, but I agree with all your recommendations. And again, if you have, so one of the questions I get asked sometimes, Michael, is, well, we have a playground in the community. Okay. So it's not, it's not a public playground. It's not a playground that's associated with a school, but we have that as one of our amenities here in the community. My recommendation is, again, reach out to association counsel and get a legal opinion on that.
That's right. There are many nuances to this as well.
So I haven't asked you yet, Michael, about your board service. So on top of everything else, you retire from being the police chief on the island. Now you've got your company. Tell me a little bit about the company you're running. And I also want to ask you how you find time to serve on your board of directors.
That's actually a very good question. I had resisted serving on my board for several years after I moved in, but I found myself knowing more about certain security situations than some of my neighbors. So I was helping out at a level that I was at least as active as a board member. And so then I finally agreed to be on the board. And then once you do that long enough, you become the president. And so that's how I'm in the situation that I'm in. My company, I started out doing everything security for ultra high net worth families, protecting them when they travel, doing evaluations of their residences, making improvements security-wise, doing investigations of all types. We do the people part of due diligence for private equity firms. And we also now advise large venues. Most of the large venues, museums and entertainment complexes and otherwise in this area, I have advised at one point or another, and are very much involved in the strategy to prevent active shooters, mass casualty incidents, and so on. But I don't want it to sound like this is an advertisement. I'm not looking for more work. How do I find time? I love where I live, and you've been there.
It's beautiful.
Without mentioning it, where it's a special location. Hope to live there for the rest of my life. Property values have at least quadrupled in the last 3 years. Stunning, like many other different places. But that's not, why I do it, because somebody has to. Right now, it's me. At some point in the future, it'll be somebody else. The responsibility of leadership is being a part of anything, and everybody has to take a part in that one time or another. I'm very fortunate that the other board members in my association are all very accomplished business leaders, have led organizations, so they have the skill set necessary to conduct the business of an association. And that's a really important part if you're a president. It's been both a challenging but a rewarding experience in being able to see the quality of life and the physical setting improved.
Well, I think that's a basic human instinct, isn't it? You want to protect. And that's, as a police officer, serve and protect. But a basic human instinct is you want to preserve and protect what you love. I know your community is lovely. It's very well maintained. Your board has done an excellent job. I always caution my boards to pick their battles wisely. I'm wondering, how has your board managed to pick your battles so wisely?
I think in any leadership role, you have to decide what a business decision is. Sometimes you may feel very strongly and have an emotional response to something, but sometimes the business decision is what to do there is completely contrary to what you'd like to do from the emotional viewpoint. Being able to recognize that, to have someone to get advice from, a competent counsel is super important. We've made mistakes, as every board has. They're usually a little bit costly. Sometimes you spend money to not get deeper in a hole. I try not to make important decisions at all on my own. I copy the other board members very frequently and seek their input on things and respect it when they vote against me, which they do sometimes, and realize that that's all part of making it work.
Do you think your law enforcement background, Michael, has informed the way you approach your board service?
Well, it has. I've been in this community over 40 years, and having been a law enforcement officer here for 28 years, I know everybody in local government, and I know the community very, very well, almost every inch of every road, because I've been over it many times. So that obviously gives me some understanding that the average person or board member wouldn't have. But when you become a good leader and you care about leadership, that's transferable. So hopefully my time as a law enforcement officer has helped prepare me for as a law enforcement executive, helped me prepare me for the business that I have and for this role as a president of the board.
I'm thinking back earlier when you mentioned in interrogating witnesses, and then I'm thinking about how you might be during a potential purchaser interview.
You've actually seen me in difficult situations where, sometimes I believe in being firm when you need to. It's very easy to go from being nice to firm, but hard to go from being very firm to nice. So, you can be both at the same time. But sometimes I have to keep myself from being the policeman of my association, because that's the natural disposition that I have. And also, one of the reasons I chose the community that I live in is everybody kind of gets along and there's a lot of tolerance. Most everybody there kind of accepts the kind of community it is. I think when you really have a problem is when someone buys a unit that has completely different expectations of what the community is. So I think it's important as a leader of a board to make sure that people know what the community is about, so they don't have unrealistic expectations, ideally before the purchase goes through. So it would be in the screening process.
You just hit the nail on the head. I live in a very similar community in Broward County. I'm in a lovely community. People have lived there for decades. I still had one of my neighbors has been there. She's now in her 90s. She's been there for 40 years. And our board approaches it much the same way you just described, which is they don't overreact. They don't underreact either. I mean, when they need to act, they do. And the community, it functions. It functions very well. And we're not without our issues, but everybody seems to like each other for the most part. And occasionally we do have somebody will come in and not understand that there's architectural control provisions. You can't paint your house Pepto-Bismol pink without there being some sort of a consequence. And, when that happens, there's a conversation. But I think we have very similar approaches, at least your board and my board in my home community. I mentioned in the intro that you played a key part in the original investigation of Jeffrey Epstein. And I know you've done a million interviews. I'm not going to ask you to even delve into that. What I do want to know is, does a case like that have a lasting impact on how you view the potential of humans in general to do harm?
Well, the Palm Beach Police Department, our investigation resulted in his felony conviction, incarceration, registration as a sex offender, and eventually his arrest in New York. We were the only law enforcement agency that was able to do that. But I think it affected everything for me. It lasted 17 years. Long after I left the police department, I felt and continue to feel a responsibility to the victims in the case because I think the state of Florida failed them. Said that numerous times. So it did change how I viewed the system. When you're a local law enforcement officer and you go to the federal authorities, you hope that they're not subject to the pressures that local and state agencies are. And in this case, they were. So it's made me certainly much more aware of the human trafficking and things that go on in large scale right here in South Florida. An experience like that does change you, yes.
I think you're a hero, and I personally want to thank you for the role you played in that.
Well, that's very kind of you. Thank you.
So on a lighter note, there's a meme on social media right now called Defund the HOA. And I'm seeing it, and, a couple of different people have sent it to me because they think it's funny because they know what I do for a living. But in all seriousness, there's been a movement for a long time calling for the abolishment of homeowners associations, that they just don't work. Not so much, they can't really do this with condos and co-ops in multifamily buildings, but in communities like yours or where I live, where you've got single family homes or townhomes, and you have a representative elected board that's overseeing things. There has been a movement for decades now saying these don't work. HOAs don't work. They're mainly comprised of petty people enforcing nitpicky rules, and they should be gone. What do you say to people who believe that?
Possibly the people that would fit that description should be gone, but the organization exists. It's a mechanism to enforce the norms and mores and rules, and those are all things that are beyond the scope of the local government to do. So someone has to do it. I think they're necessary in a civil society. I think some of the references you made to doing away with an HOA might be an HOA where they have single family homes, and I suppose that's been done a few places, but when you have multifamily buildings of any type, or there are lots of recreational elements that are shared costs, I just don't know how that would work. I would like to see what happens to a community after they have disbanded their HOA. I don't think it's a place that you or I or anyone would want to live, because there's really nobody doing anything beyond what the government ordinances and laws require, and they're not going to be able to enforce them much because there's so many other places that would ask for that as well. I think that's a passing thing. What do you think?
Well, what I think is, listen, there are pros and cons to everything, and everything in life is a trade-off. But I will tell you, I have very dear friends that my husband and I just went out to dinner with. They live in the acres. And the acres in Plantation, there are no, in their particular area, there's not a homeowners association, but they're lovely homes on acre or larger lots. And it was a cul-de-sac. And for many years, there was an extreme holiday Christmas lighting event on that cul-de-sac. And there was no homeowners association. And they just endured And I mean, they endured thousands of people coming at night, leaving garbage, the noise, the lights, and they tried to work with the city, not so successfully. And the situation's been resolved because the owners left. But I always use that as an example of this is where a homeowners association can be truly of value, because these cities, they don't necessarily want to take back all these homeowners associations. They don't want to be involved with this, with the maintenance. So I think it's fashionable to grumble about one's HOA, but it's not realistic to think that they're going anywhere anytime soon.
Maybe it's an individual problem. The individuals create the problem, but not the structure. The structure has to go on, but the wrong people are in leadership positions for these places where they want to do away with.
Which is why I would urge any listener who has not listened to Carmelo Millamachi's leadership coaching episode. He really did he condensed, Michael, 6 months of leadership training. And this whole conversation has been peppered with the word leadership, and he condensed 6 months of leadership training into a 1-hour episode. And we discussed that very point, that very often these boards do not have people who really understand those coaching modalities and how they could be useful in governing the community. So you've been so generous with your time. I want to thank you. I want to just, before I let you go, I want to talk a little bit about your social media presence. I follow you on Instagram. I love your pictures. You seem to have some great nature photography. You've got you seem to garden. You've got beautiful pictures. How did you get into that?
How did I get into that? I think my kids had Instagram. And I thought, well, it would be a way for me to see more about their adults, more of their lives. So I started contributing my own. But I've been a photographer since I was 8 years old, and it's my way to connect to nature and an outlet for creativity. And I like to experiment a lot with photography. You probably saw, I might be the only person that has successfully photographed the rings around Saturn with an iPhone.
I can't even take a picture of my cat that's centered properly. So that's impressive.
Oh, I've seen yours. Your Instagram is interesting as well. But I like time-lapse photography. Occasionally I'll have a flower or a fruit or something I'm growing, and I'll put a camera on it for a week or so, and you actually get to see it growing. It's a fun thing to do. I'm not on there for the reasons that many of people are, but it's a way to stay in touch and see each other's photographs and, comment and commend those people that put a little bit of time and effort into it.
Well, Michael, is there any final thoughts you want to share before I let you go?
I'd just like to thank you and your firm for doing this, because until you asked me to be on your podcast, I had not listened to any of the prior ones that you've done. And I think I've listened to about half of them so far, and I learned a lot, and I've been on a board for 8 years. It has been very useful to me, particularly in listening to an intelligent discussion of the emerging issues. You need to get an iguana expert on to talk about that. If all the associations that are in coastal South Florida, that's a big problem. But thank you for doing this. I think you do a great job at it, and it's a free service to everyone.
Well, thank you. And thanks again for joining us today, Michael. Thank you for joining us today. Don't forget to follow and rate us on your favorite podcast platform, or visit takeittotheboard.com for more ways to connect.